Little girl saw a German shepherd beside a fallen treehouse. What happened next left all in tears. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story deserves to be heard. The evening had a strange kind of stillness, the kind that follows after a storm has passed. In the small American town of Maplewood, the streets were damp, littered with broken twigs and scattered leaves. Puddles reflected the bruised colors of the sky, and trees leaned under the weight of the wind that had howled through just hours before. The storm had shaken the town, but it was the silence afterward that made the night feel different, like the world was waiting for something unseen. On the edge of this quiet town, a little girl named Clara wandered barefoot in her backyard, her blue cotton dress brushing against her knees as she tiptoed through the wet grass. She was only 4 years old, but her eyes carried that spark of curiosity children are blessed with, the kind that sees the world not for its dangers but for its wonders. Her golden hair clung in damp strands to her cheeks, and in her hand she carried a doll missing one shoe, a companion to her lonely evening play. The yard stretched into a patch of woods where an old treehouse once stood proudly, perched high above in a sturdy oak. Clara had often looked at it from below, imagining adventures her older cousins might have had their years before. But tonight, something felt different. Drawn by the storm's aftermath, she toddled closer to the woods, her small shoes squishing in the mud with every step. The smell of wet earth was thick, and in the distance, the faint call of a crow echoed like a reminder that the storm had left its mark. As she reached the clearing, her eyes widened. The treehouse had fallen. Its wooden beams were scattered across the ground, tangled in the remains of the oak's broken branches. What had once been a child's secret kingdom was now nothing but shattered wood and splintered dreams, resting like a relic of forgotten summers. Clara froze, her doll pressed tightly against her chest. Something about the broken treehouse pulled at her heart, as if even she could sense it was more than just wood lying on the ground. And then she heard it. At first, she thought it was just the sound of wind whispering through the branches. But no. The sound was heavier, raw, trembling. A faint whimper. A sound so filled with pain it sent a shiver through her tiny frame. She tilted her head, listening, her eyes darting across the wreckage. And then she saw him. Beside the fallen treehouse, half hidden by vines and broken planks, lay a German shepherd. His once majestic coat was matted with mud and dirt, his ribs stark against his fragile frame. One paw was scraped raw, his sides rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. His ears drooped lifelessly, and his eyes were closed, as if the strength to face the world had finally left him. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had seen dogs before, on leashes in neighbors' yards, wagging their tails at the park, but never like this. Never one so broken, so silent, so utterly defeated. For a moment, fear tugged at her. She remembered whispers she had overheard from adults. Strays can be dangerous. You never know what they've been through. But when she looked at the shepherd again, she didn't see danger. She saw sorrow. She saw a cry for help without words. Her small steps carried her closer until she stood only feet away from him. The dog stirred slightly, letting out another weak whimper, his body trembling as though even breathing cost him everything. Clara crouched down, her doll dangling loosely at her side. In the trembling voice of a child not yet old enough to fear cruelty, she whispered, "Hi there, it's okay." For a long moment, nothing happened. The rain dripped softly from the broken branches, the woods silent except for the shallow breaths of the shepherd. And then, slowly he lifted his head. His weary eyes opened just enough to find hers. Clara's heart swelled, her fear melting into something stronger, something innocent and pure. She extended her tiny hand, not touching yet, just letting him know she was there. The shepherd's gaze lingered, heavy with exhaustion, but in that look was trust, fragile yet unbroken. And that was how it began. A storm's wreckage, a fallen treehouse, a little girl in a blue dress, and a shepherd too weak to stand. Two souls, one too young to know fear, the other too broken to fight, met in that quiet clearing. What happened next would not only change Clara's life forever, it would leave the entire town in tears. The treehouse had not always been this way, broken, leaning, abandoned in the quiet shadows of the woods. Once upon a time, it had been a proud fortress, nailed together with love and reckless bravery by children who believed no height was too high and no dream too impossible. Generations of small-town kids had climbed its rope ladder, whispering secrets, sharing candy, and chasing fireflies as the summer sun dipped below the horizon. It had been a place of laughter, of scraped knees and big imaginations. But like so many things in Maplewood, it had been forgotten with time. Its wood had grown damp and soft, its paint chipped, its floorboards creaking like old bones. And now, after the storm, it had finally collapsed, splintered and lying against the roots of the tree that once held it up. Clara stood just a few feet from the wreckage, her blue dress clinging to her knees, her doll dangling limply at her side. She was too young to remember the treehouse in its glory days, too young to know the echoes of children's voices that once rang inside its wooden walls. But somehow, even at 4 years old, she felt the sadness of it. She tilted her head, golden hair falling across her damp cheek, and gazed at the pieces of wood scattered across the ground as though they were bones of a fallen giant. The little girl lived with her grandparents in the farmhouse just beyond the yard, a white building with peeling shutters and a porch swing that groaned with every shift of the wind. Her parents, caught in struggles too heavy for love to carry, had left her in the care of the only people steady enough to raise her. Grandpa James, with his calloused hands and soft voice, and Grandma Ruth, with her gentle patience, had filled her days with stories, warm biscuits, and the kind of quiet stability a child doesn't know to cherish until she is older. Still, even with their love, Clara carried a small loneliness inside her, a space only a child can feel when the world has already taken pieces too big to understand. And so she found friends where she could. She fed the birds that gathered on the fence each morning, scattering crumbs from her toast into the grass. She spoke to the fireflies at night, whispering that they were stars who had come down just to keep her company. Her dolls were never just toys. They were confidants, each one with a name, a voice, a role in her small universe. The world outside her home, even in its brokenness, seemed to come alive in her presence. It was this innocence that brought her closer to the wreckage of the treehouse that night. Her steps were slow, careful, almost reverent as she edged closer to the heap of wood. But it wasn't the broken boards that made her heart quicken. It was the shape lying against them. The German shepherd had barely moved since she first spotted him. His body was curled tightly, his sides rising and falling with shallow breaths. Mud clung to his fur in clumps, streaking the once rich brown and black coat into something unrecognizable. His ribs pressed against his skin like a map of hunger, each breath a visible struggle. One paw was scraped raw, small streaks of dried blood painting the fur a darker shade. His ears drooped low, one torn slightly at the tip, scars tracing faint lines along his body like whispers of a story no one had cared enough to listen to. Clara's heart squeezed inside her tiny chest. She had seen tired dogs before, the neighbor's hound that sometimes wandered lazily onto their porch, the mutt that followed the mail truck through town. But she had never seen one like this. This was not tiredness. This was defeat. This was a soul that had been fighting too long, and now, here beside the wreckage of a once beloved treehouse, he seemed to have surrendered, She crouched in the grass, her knees pressing into the damp earth, and studied him with the solemnity only a child could bring. The storm had taken the treehouse, and in some cruel poetry, it had given her this shepherd in return. The two were the same, once strong, now broken, left to be forgotten. The dog stirred faintly, his eyes fluttering open just enough to catch hers. They were not fierce eyes, not the eyes of an animal ready to bite or defend. They were weary, heavy with stories of places Clara would never see, but gentle, so very gentle, as they landed on the face of a child kneeling in the mud. For a moment, Clara didn't move. Her grandparents had warned her before about strays. They might be sick, they might be wild, you mustn't get too close. But the words seemed to drift away like the storm clouds above. All she could see was the shepherd's trembling sides, his weak breaths, and the way his eyes pleaded without sound. Her doll slipped from her hand and landed softly on the grass. Without hesitation, Clara reached for it, brushed the dirt from its faded dress, and then did something remarkable. She gently set the doll down beside the shepherd, nestling it against his paw as though the toy could keep him company. "There," she whispered in the quiet, her voice trembling but kind. "You don't have to be alone." The shepherd's head shifted weakly, his muzzle brushing against the doll, his breath warming its tiny fabric body. It was a small thing, so small that most of the world would have missed it entirely. But in that gesture, one child's offering of comfort and one broken animal's silent acceptance, something larger than words was born. The broken treehouse loomed behind them, a symbol of laughter lost to time. But here, in the damp grass, another kind of story was beginning. A story not of endings, but of fragile beginnings. A girl who had already known too much absence, and a dog who had been abandoned by the world, met in the shadow of something that had also been left behind. The air was still damp, the smell of the storm lingering, the town still unaware. But Clara and the shepherd knew. In their silence, they knew. And from that moment, the story of Maplewood would never be the same. The air hung heavy as the evening deepened, thunder rolling faintly in the distance as if the storm wasn't finished with the town just yet. Clara stayed crouched beside the broken treehouse, her tiny blue dress damp from the wet grass, her doll now lying forgotten near the shepherd's paw. She looked back once at the warm glow of the farmhouse windows, then turned again to the dog whose shallow breaths tugged at her heart. To her, it wasn't a question. He needed help, and that was all that mattered. From the porch, her grandmother called out again. "Clara, supper's waiting. Come inside, darling." The words floated through the breeze, but the child didn't move. Her eyes, wide with worry, stayed fixed on the shepherd. When her grandfather came striding across the yard, boots squishing in the mud, she jumped to her feet and pointed desperately. "Grandpa, he's hurt. Please, we have to help him." James stopped short when he saw the animal. His weathered face tightened, and his voice grew sharp. "Clara, step away from him right now. Strays can be dangerous." But the little girl shook her head, her blonde hair sticking to her damp cheeks. "He's not dangerous. He's just tired. He's sad." Her words were as simple as her heart, clear, unclouded by fear. Ruth had joined them now, clutching her shawl against her chest. She gasped when her eyes fell on the shepherd's scarred body. "James, she shouldn't be near that thing. It could snap." Clara's lower lip quivered, but she didn't back away. "He won't hurt me. He's asking for help. Can't you see?" The old couple exchanged a look, one born from years of caution and hard lessons life had carved into them. They knew what fear was, what pain could bring out in an animal cornered by cruelty. To them, wisdom meant distance. But Clara had only ever known the world through innocence, through the kindness she gave to birds, to fireflies, to her dolls. And so where they saw danger, she saw only a soul left behind. The shepherd whimpered faintly, and Clara knelt again, her tiny knees sinking into the mud. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. Her small hand reached between the broken planks, trembling but determined. Both grandparents cried out in alarm, but before they could stop her, the miracle happened. The shepherd lifted his head weakly. With a slowness that spoke of exhaustion rather than aggression, he stretched forward. His tongue, warm and trembling, brushed gently against Clara's fingers. A fragile lick. A silent thank you. Clara's eyes filled with tears, her face breaking into a smile that carried both relief and wonder. "See," she gasped, looking back at her grandparents. "He knows I want to help." James stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his breath caught. He had expected teeth, a growl, some instinct of defense. But what he saw instead was trust placed not in him, not in Ruth, but in the little girl who had refused to look away. The shepherd let his head fall back onto the earth, too weak to hold it up any longer, but the choice he had made was undeniable. In that small gesture, he had given Clara what the adults could not. Proof that innocence sometimes sees truths wisdom has long forgotten. Ruth's eyes softened with tears, and she gripped her husband's arm. "She's right," she whispered. "He's not dangerous. He's broken." James exhaled heavily, his gaze moving from his granddaughter's pleading eyes to the battered creature lying at her knees. Fear still tugged at him, but something else pulled stronger. The realization that this child's compassion had pierced through barriers his own caution could not. Slowly, he knelt beside Clara, placing a hand on her shoulder. "All right," he said, voice low but steady. "We'll help him." Clara's face lit up like the first rays of sun after rain. She turned back to the shepherd, stroking his muzzle softly. "Hear that? You're not alone anymore." Above them, the storm clouds gathered, thunder grumbling closer, the wind rattling the branches like an unfinished warning. But in that clearing, something greater than fear had taken root. A bond had been born in the space between a child's innocent courage and an animal's weary surrender. And as James rose again, mud heavy on his boots but a strange softness in his chest, he realized that sometimes children carry a vision sharper than adults, the ability to see a cry for love where the world sees only danger. The decision had been made, but decisions were one thing and action another. James stood over the fallen treehouse, his weathered face grim as he studied the tangled mess of planks and branches. The shepherd whimpered again, his paw pinned awkwardly under the weight of splintered wood. Every time he tried to shift, pain jolted through him, forcing a broken howl from his throat. Clara clung to her grandfather's sleeve, her wide eyes shimmering in the dimming light. "We'll need tools," James muttered, already turning back toward the farmhouse. "The wood's too heavy to move with bare hands." Ruth hurried after him, torn between fear for her granddaughter and pity for the animal. Within minutes James returned, carrying a crowbar and a coil of rope, his boots caked with mud from the yard. Clara refused to leave the shepherd's side, so Ruth stayed close too, lantern in hand as the evening grew darker. The quiet of the woods was broken only by the rasping breaths of the dog and the distant rumble of thunder rolling closer once again. James knelt beside the broken beams, his rough hands probing the wreckage. His paws stuck tight, he said grimly. "Wood's pressing down hard. We'll need more strength." Clara looked up at him, her lip trembling. "Then we'll get more," she whispered. Word spread quickly in small towns. Within half an hour, 2 neighbors arrived, men James had known for years, each carrying tools of their own. One brought an axe, the other a sturdy jack usually used for lifting wagons. The men frowned when they saw the shepherd, their first instincts echoing the same fears James had voiced earlier. But one glance at Clara, kneeling in the mud with her hand resting gently on the dog's head, silenced their doubts. They could see it. Whatever fear the dog might have held, It had already been replaced with trust. The first drops of rain began to fall as the men set to work. James wedged the crowbar under the heaviest plank while the neighbor worked the jack into place. Wood groaned, mud shifted, and the shepherd yelped as pressure jostled his injured paw. Clara pressed closer, whispering soothing words into his ear. "It's okay, almost there. Don't be scared. We're helping." The rain quickened, pattering on the leaves, soaking through Clara's dress until it clung to her small frame. Still she did not move. She held the lantern steady, her hands trembling under its weight but her gaze never leaving the shepherd. The men strained, grunting with effort as the wood resisted them. The wreckage was waterlogged, heavier than it had been hours before, the mud sucking at every movement. The jack creaked, the crowbar bent, and still the beam barely shifted. James cursed under his breath, his arms shaking. "It's no use," he growled. But Clara's voice cut through the rain. "Don't stop. Please, Grandpa, don't stop. He needs us." The shepherd whimpered louder, his ribs heaving, his eyes rolling with desperation. The sound pierced through every heart present. Ruth wiped rain from her face and dropped to her knees beside Clara, adding her voice. "James, try again. For her sake, try again." The men adjusted their grip, mud splattering as they reset their tools. Together, with a heave that strained every muscle, they pushed. Wood creaked, the jack groaned louder, and slowly, painfully slowly, the beam began to lift. The shepherd howled in agony as his paw shifted free, his body lurching in fear and pain. Clara leaned down, her hand pressing against his neck, whispering through her tears, "You're okay. You're safe now. Just hold on a little longer." With one final shove, the men toppled the beam aside. The wreckage collapsed into the mud with a heavy thud. For a moment, no one moved, their breaths ragged from the struggle, the rain falling harder now, soaking them through. Then the shepherd sagged forward, his body too weak to hold itself upright. He stumbled once, twice, and collapsed fully into the mud. Clara cried out, her tiny hands reaching for him. "No, don't leave me, please don't." But the dog was not gone. His chest rose and fell, shallow but steady, his eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. He had simply spent every ounce of strength he had left. Clara dropped the lantern beside her and knelt in the mud, pulling the shepherd's great head into her lap. Rain streamed down her face, mixing with tears as she stroked the soaked fur. The dog did not resist. He let his weight sink into her, his breaths ragged but calmer now, soothed by the warmth of her small hands and the softness of her voice. James watched in silence, the crowbar slipping from his fingers into the mud. He had feared this moment, feared what danger a broken animal might bring. But as he looked at his granddaughter cradling the shepherd's head, he understood something he could not put into words. This was no danger. This was deliverance. The neighbors stood back, their hats dripping, their eyes lowered as if they had just witnessed something too sacred to interrupt. Ruth knelt beside Clara, gently brushing wet hair from the girl's forehead. "You did it, sweetheart," she whispered. "He's free now." Clara looked up, her eyes shining with both tears and rain. "We didn't do it," she said softly. "He did. He trusted us." The shepherd shifted faintly, his nose brushing against the doll still lying nearby, as though acknowledging the comfort it had given him. Then, with what little strength remained, his tail flicked once in the mud, a gesture small but undeniable. And there, in the ruins of a fallen treehouse, beneath a storm still rumbling in the skies, a bond was sealed. A child's refusal to give up, a town's reluctant hands joining in, and a broken animal's fragile trust came together in one unforgettable moment. The rain fell heavier, soaking them all, but no one cared. The shepherd was free, and with his head resting in the lap of a little girl in a blue dress, The story of Maplewood was just beginning. The rain did not let up as the shepherd collapsed into Clara's lap, his strength spent and his breath shallow. James stood for a long moment, chest heaving from the strain of the rescue, then nodded grimly to the neighbors. "We can't leave him out here. He won't last the night." Without another word, the men bent down, straining to lift the dog's heavy, mud-caked body. Even weakened, he was still large, his ribs sharp under their hands, his weight unwieldy. Clara ran beside them, her tiny legs splashing through puddles, whispering encouragements as though her voice alone might carry him the rest of the way. They carried the shepherd into the barn, the familiar scent of hay and wood mixing with the sharp tang of wet dog. James set down an old quilt on a bed of straw, and the men lowered the animal carefully onto it. The shepherd whimpered, curling slightly as his body adjusted, his sides trembling. Clara knelt at once, refusing to leave his side. "It's okay," she murmured. "You're safe now." Ruth appeared moments later with a basin of warm water, a stack of clean rags, and the old first aid kit she kept tucked away in the kitchen. "This is all we've got," she said softly, setting them down beside her husband. James dipped a rag into the steaming water and began wiping the mud from the shepherd's coat. Each stroke revealed more of the truth, the scars hidden beneath the dirt, the faint grooves around his neck where a collar must have once dug in too tightly, the raw patches that spoke of rope burns. Clara's small fingers traced the marks, her eyes wide with sadness. "Who could do this to him?" she whispered. No one answered. The silence was louder than words. James worked methodically, cleaning the dog's wounds as best he could, while Ruth wrapped a blanket over his damp body. The shepherd flinched at first, a low whine escaping his throat, but then Clara leaned close, resting her hand gently on his head. At her touch, he stilled. His eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, softened, and his breathing eased. It was as though the presence of the child carried more healing than the warm water or the careful bandages. Hours passed in that barn. The lantern flickered, casting golden light over the hay-strewn floor as rain tapped steadily on the roof. James tried coaxing the shepherd to drink from a bowl of water, but the dog turned his head away, too weary, too distrustful. It wasn't until Clara dipped her tiny fingers in and let the drops fall against his muzzle that he finally lapped once, then again, his tongue slow but deliberate. She smiled through her fatigue. "See, Grandpa? He just needed me to show him." Later, Ruth brought out a small dish of broth-soaked bread. James set it near the shepherd's paws, but again the dog refused to eat. His ribs moved sharply with each breath, his body language closed and guarded. Clara frowned, then sat cross-legged beside him, her doll balanced carefully in her lap. She picked up a piece of the softened bread, broke it into smaller bits, and whispered, "It's just food. It'll make you strong." She placed the crumbs gently near his mouth. The shepherd sniffed once, hesitant. Then, with a faint lick, he took the offering. Clara clapped her hands softly, her face glowing. "Good boy." Piece by piece, she fed him, and though the meal was meager, the trust it signaled was more nourishing than anything else. James and Ruth exchanged a look in the lamplight, equal parts astonishment and quiet understanding. As the night deepened, Clara grew tired, her head nodding, her small voice humming an old tune Ruth often sang to her at bedtime. She wasn't singing for the dog, not at first. She was singing to her dolls, rocking them gently as she always did. But as her lullaby filled the barn, soft and simple, the shepherd's ears twitched. His tail, still weak, gave the faintest wag against the quilt. His eyes half closed, and for the first time since they had found him, he seemed at peace. Ruth pressed a hand to her mouth, tears in her eyes. "James," she whispered, "do you see? He's listening to her." James nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the child and the dog lying side by side in the glow of the lantern. "Sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine," he murmured. "Sometimes it comes from love." The shepherd shifted then, resting his head against Clara's leg. She stilled her doll and looked down at him, her small hand stroking the side of his scarred face. "I'll stay with you," she whispered, her words as much a promise to herself as to him. "No one will hurt you anymore." The rain outside softened to a drizzle, the barn creaked gently in the night, and in that silence, something unspoken was forged. The broken treehouse had revealed a broken dog, but in the presence of a child who knew nothing of cruelty, only kindness, the first threads of trust were woven. The shepherd's breathing steadied. Clara's lullaby trailed off as she drifted into sleep, her doll clutched against her chest, her other hand still resting protectively on the dog's head. And there, in the straw and shadows, a bond was born, not of words, not of promises, but of silence. By morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the town of Maplewood washed in silver light. Dew clung to the grass like tiny crystals, and the smell of wet pine hung thick in the air. Clara stirred awake in the barn, her small frame curled against the shepherd's side. His breathing, though shallow, was steadier than it had been the night before, and when she stirred, his eyes fluttered open as though he had been keeping guard even in his sleep. Word traveled quickly in towns like Maplewood. By the time the sun was fully above the treetops, neighbors began to arrive, curious, concerned, carrying baskets of food or just their whispers. Some had already heard from James, who had mentioned the rescue while fetching more supplies. Others came because gossip had a way of outpacing truth. Soon a small crowd gathered outside the barn, their voices hushed, their eyes wide as they peeked inside at the scarred, mud-streaked shepherd lying on the straw with a little girl's hand resting protectively on his head. "My lord," muttered Mrs. Dawson, the baker's wife, pressing a hand to her chest. "What on earth happened to that poor animal?" "He was trapped," James explained, his voice low and serious. "Pinned under the treehouse when the storm knocked it down. Couldn't have freed himself if he tried." Gasps circled the group. The story carried weight not just because of the dog, but because of who had found him. The image of Clara, the quiet little girl in her blue dress, kneeling beside the broken treehouse, refusing to move until the shepherd was freed, it spread faster than the storm clouds that had broken the night before. By midday, the story had already become something more than fact. It was a tale of innocence meeting cruelty, of compassion refusing to be silenced. Sheriff Miller arrived that afternoon, his uniform damp from the wet ground, his notebook already in hand. He was a man of steady composure, known for his patience, but when he stepped into the barn and saw the shepherd's scarred body, his jaw tightened. He knelt beside the animal, careful not to startle him, his eyes tracing the marks on the dog's neck and shoulders. "These aren't just wounds from a storm," he said finally, his tone grim. "These are scars from a collar worn too long. Rope burns. Cuts that don't happen by accident." James folded his arms, his expression darkening. "So he wasn't just unlucky?" "No," Miller replied, scribbling notes. "This dog was left here. Deliberately." The neighbors, still gathered at the barn door, gasped again. The idea that cruelty could live so close unsettled them more than the storm ever had. Clara, sitting cross-legged beside the shepherd, looked up at the sheriff with wide eyes. "He wasn't left," she whispered softly, as though correcting him. "He was thrown away." The room stilled at her words. Even the sheriff paused, his pen hanging above the paper. Out of the mouths of children came truths that adults sometimes struggled to put into words. Miller cleared his throat. "I've heard rumors," he said carefully. "There's been talk of someone nearby, someone involved in trading dogs. Breeding them for money, then discarding the ones that aren't useful anymore. I didn't want to believe it, but—" He gestured toward the shepherd. "This may be proof." The air thickened with unease. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. Everyone in town had their suspicions about the man who lived on the edge of Maplewood, Harold Briggs, a bitter loner with a yard full of chained dogs and eyes that never softened. He had been fined once for neglect, but nothing had ever stuck. People whispered about the noises at night, the shadows moving behind his shed, the animals that disappeared. Now, looking at the shepherd's battered body, the whispers grew louder. "Do you think Briggs had something to do with this?" James asked, his voice hard. Miller didn't answer directly, but the silence was heavy. "We'll investigate," he said instead, snapping his notebook shut. As the sheriff left, the weight of his words settled over the barn. The neighbors murmured uneasily, glancing toward the woods as though expecting the villain to appear from the shadows at any moment. Claire, however, remained still. She stroked the shepherd's ears softly, her face calm but determined. "He doesn't belong to them anymore," she said simply. From that day, Clara became the heart of the story. People spoke of her courage, of the way she had pressed her hand through broken planks without fear, of how the shepherd had trusted her when no one else dared. In the bakery, in the church, on the benches outside the general store, they called her an angel, too small to carry such a burden, yet somehow strong enough to break through walls adults couldn't. But under the admiration, there was fear. Fear that whoever had abandoned the shepherd might want him back. Not for love, but for profit, for cruelty. Whispers grew in hushed voices. What if they come looking? What if they try to take him? That night, after the crowd had gone and the barn was quiet again, James locked the doors with more care than usual. He checked the windows twice, then sat in the kitchen long after Ruth had gone to bed. The lantern burned low, casting shadows on the wall, while outside the crickets sang. Clara had refused to sleep in her own bed. She lay curled in the straw beside the shepherd, her doll tucked under her chin. The dog, though still weak, kept his muzzle pressed near her small hand as if anchoring himself to her presence. James watched them through the half-open barn door. For the first time in years, he felt a stirring of both hope and dread. Hope, because in Clara he saw a courage that shamed the adults around her. Dread, because in the world he knew, innocence was fragile, and cruelty rarely gave up without a fight. The shepherd shifted in his sleep, a faint whine escaping his throat, as though even dreams carried the weight of chains. Clara stirred beside him, murmuring softly, her hand brushing his fur. Almost instantly, he quieted, his body relaxing again. James's chest tightened at the sight. There was no denying it anymore. The dog had chosen her. And she, without hesitation, had chosen him. The treehouse had fallen, but in its broken shadow, something else had risen. A bond so unshakable it had become the talk of the town. Yet just beyond the whispers of admiration lurked darker whispers still, the kind that sent shutters closing at night and eyes watching the road. For every story of compassion, there was always a shadow of cruelty nearby. And as Maplewood drifted to sleep, the question hung in the damp summer air like thunder that never quite broke. Would the villains return to claim what they had once thrown away? The days that followed unfolded like the slow turning of a page, each one bringing a little more light back into the lives of those who had been touched by the fallen treehouse and the broken shepherd. At first, the dog barely stirred from the quilt in the barn. His ribs still pressed sharply against his skin, his paws bandaged, his breath shallow. But with each sunrise, something subtle shifted. His eyes lingered longer on the little girl who had refused to abandon him, and his head lifted higher whenever she entered the room. Clara became his anchor. She came to him every morning, her small hands carrying bowls of water or scraps of food. He refused food from anyone else. James could place broth right beneath his nose, and still the shepherd would turn away. But when Clara scooped a piece of bread in her tiny palm and offered it, he would take it delicately, his tongue brushing her fingers as if he understood the gift she was giving him. Ruth watched this quietly, her heart aching with both pride and sorrow. The child had suffered so much since her parents' separation, retreating into the company of dolls and birdsong. But now her laughter had begun to return, faint at first and then brighter, like sunshine breaking through a storm. The change did not go unnoticed. Neighbors who had once whispered fearfully about strays began arriving at the farmhouse with baskets in hand. Mrs. Dawson brought leftover stew bones from the bakery, wrapped carefully in paper. Mr. Green from the hardware store arrived with salves and ointments meant to ease the shepherd's wounds. Even the schoolteacher, Miss Perkins, carried over a sack of blankets stitched by her students, insisting that the dog should be warm. Each visitor left with the same story, the shepherd's wary eyes softening only when Clara sat beside him, his head pressed against her knee as if she were the only reason he was still holding on. With each act of kindness, the town itself began to change. Where once suspicion had ruled, whispers about cruelty, mutters about danger, now compassion grew like wildflowers in the cracks left behind by the storm. People who rarely spoke beyond polite greetings lingered longer on porches, discussing the fate of the shepherd. Strangers offered rides, food, even tools, as if helping the dog was no longer just a family task but a duty shared by everyone. Then came the day when James returned from the barn to find Clara tugging gently at his sleeve, her eyes full of a request too large for words. "Grandpa," she said softly, pointing toward the ruins of the treehouse. "Can we fix it?" For him. James hesitated. The old treehouse had been nothing but a hazard for years, forgotten by the children who had grown up and left. But as he looked at his granddaughter, her blue dress streaked with straw, her hands clasped together in hope, he felt the weight of what she was truly asking. She wanted to give the shepherd not just food and water, but a home. The next morning, men and women from the town gathered beneath the broken oak. They brought hammers, nails, saws, and planks of fresh wood. Even children came, carrying brushes and cans of paint. Under the warm glow of summer sun, laughter mingled with the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Clara stood at the edge, holding the shepherd's leash. Though still weak, he walked carefully beside her, his head held low but steady, his eyes following every swing of the hammer, every piece of wood lifted. It was as though he understood this was for him. Piece by piece, the ruins were transformed. The treehouse was not rebuilt to its former height. No one wanted to risk another fall, but instead reshaped into a sturdy shelter on the ground, a sanctuary where the shepherd could rest. Fresh straw lined the floor, a roof protected against rain, and Clara insisted on placing her dolls inside, so he won't feel lonely. The final touch came from the schoolchildren, who painted the wooden boards with bright colors, blues, yellows, and reds that turned the shelter into something halfway between a playhouse and a monument. When the work was finished, Clara led the shepherd inside. He stepped hesitantly at first, sniffing the fresh wood, his tail twitching. Then, with a weary sigh, he lay down on the straw, curling against the wall as though he finally believed he had a place of his own. Clara sat beside him, stroking his ears, her eyes shining. "See," she whispered, "it's yours now." The townsfolk watched in silence, some with tears in their eyes. For all the storms and cruelty the world had thrown, this simple scene, a child and a dog resting inside a rebuilt treehouse, was proof that compassion could mend even the deepest cracks. From then on, the shepherd was no longer seen as just a stray. He became Maplewood's guardian, a living reminder of both survival and loyalty. He followed Clara everywhere, down the lane to the creek where she fed ducks, across the meadow where she gathered wildflowers, even to the porch where she played with her dolls. Wherever she went, his shadow followed, his presence a quiet shield against the world. And with each step he took, Clara's loneliness faded. The silence that had haunted her since her parents' departure was replaced by laughter, bright, unrestrained laughter that spilled across the yard and carried into the town. Neighbors paused in their work to listen, smiling at the sound, knowing it was the laughter of a child whose heart had been healed by the very creature others had once feared. In the weeks that followed, the townspeople began to call Clara by a new name. At first, it was just murmured among the elders at the general store, then whispered with affection by the schoolchildren. Soon, it was spoken openly, proudly, the guardian angel of the treehouse. The title stuck, not because she had built the shelter, but because she had built something far greater. In her small, stubborn heart, she had refused to see danger where others saw it, and in doing so, she had awakened an entire community to the power of compassion. The treehouse was no longer just a place of broken wood and forgotten summers. It had become a monument to kindness, to resilience, to a bond that defied cruelty. On warm evenings, families gathered near the rebuilt shelter, bringing pies, music, and stories. Children played tag in the yard, their laughter echoing among the trees, while the shepherd sat calmly at Clara's side, his scars still visible but no longer defining him. To the people of Maplewood, he was no longer a victim but a symbol, a reminder that survival was not enough, that healing required love, and that even the faintest cry deserved to be answered. And in every retelling of the story, one truth always remained. It had all begun with a little girl in a blue dress who refused to walk away. Sometimes the faintest cries come from the places we've long forgotten. The broken treehouse at the edge of Maplewood had once echoed with the laughter of children, but years of silence had reduced it to rotting wood and shadows. And yet, from its ruins came a cry so fragile it might have been lost to the storm, had a little girl not listened. The shepherd, once discarded and left to die, became more than just an animal saved. He became a teacher. His loyalty reminded the town that devotion doesn't fade with scars, that even the most broken can still choose trust. His eyes carried pain, yes, but they also carried a message. Survival is possible, and love can make survival beautiful. But above all, it was Clara, the child in the blue dress, who showed them the truth adults too often forget. Where others saw danger, she saw need. Where others hesitated, she reached out. Her innocence was not weakness, but strength, the kind of strength that rebuilds not just a fallen treehouse, but an entire community's faith in kindness. The story of Clara and the shepherd became Maplewood's story. It was told in kitchens, whispered in prayers, and carried in the laughter that returned to a once quiet yard. And with each retelling, the lesson grew clearer. Love heals wounds deeper than scars, and loyalty never fades. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty that never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from, because sometimes a simple act of compassion can change everything.